What I'm going to do first is to give you a general introduction about contemporary philosophy, okay, so that we don't get the impression that when we talk of contemporary philosophy, it is just about existentialism and phenomenology and postmodernism. Because when we say contemporary philosophy, it covers many different philosophies. Let's not call it a system because some of these are not really systems, but there are schools of thought. There are philosophies, right? And when we think of contemporary philosophy, it covers the period between the beginning of the 19th century up to the 20th century. And we can see in this span of time the emergence of different philosophies or schools of thought. And the first among these is the philosophy developed by Karl Marx and his friend Friedrich Engels. And we call this dialectical materialism. But of course, we can also include in the proponents of dialectical materialism Ludwig Feuerbach. But of course, only in the materialism part, not the dialectical part. Dialectical materialism is a combination of the philosophy of materialism and the philosophy of dialectics, or at least the process of dialectics. And Marx was influenced by the materialism of Ludwig Feuerbach. Okay? So materialism teaches that matter is the only reality. Matter is the only reality. So a materialistic philosophy would deny the existence of spiritual beings or the spiritual realm. So they only acknowledge the existence of the physical or material realm. And Marx took from Hegel the idea of the dialectics. So he combined the materialism of Feuerbach and the dialectical process of Hegel. Okay? He disregarded the idealism of Hegel, just took this dialectical process and then apply the dialectics to the manifestation of matter. So for Marx, matter is the only reality, and this reality, matter itself, manifests itself through the opposition of the thesis and antithesis. So dialectical materialism is a kind of theory of reality. It's a kind of metaphysics or ontology. It explains how reality is through the operation of matter and the process of the dialectics. But Engels and Marx distinctly applied this notion of dialectics or dialectical materialism to the history. Okay, so there is historical dialectics or historical materialism, the historical dialectical materialism, because Marx and Engels applied this idea of dialectical materialism to the development of history. So according to them, history is the history of class struggle between the rich and the powerful class. So there is now a dialectics and opposition between classes of people, social classes. The rich, the powerful, and the poor and the oppressed, or the proletariat. Okay? So that's one philosophy in contemporary philosophy. Okay? The next is positivism. And positivism was represented by Auguste Comte. There is a similarity between materialism and positivism because a positivist would always look at the material or the concrete or the physical. But it's not really materialism in the sense that it's the focus of positivism is on the facts that can be used in the sciences. Okay, because for them, only the facts have scientific value. Only facts are positive, positive in the sense that they have value. Okay, so positivism is anchored on a materialistic philosophy. Positivism. So it's important to note that positivism is a scientific attitude. It's a scientific perspective. In science, we don't deal with things that we cannot see, that we cannot perceive. And what are those things that we cannot see, we cannot perceive? Well, those things that we consider to be spiritual or metaphysical. Because the metaphysical objects cannot be seen, it cannot be perceived. And if it cannot be perceived, then they don't have value at all. They don't have positive value, or they don't have scientific value. So when you say positivism, it means factual, it means concrete, it means scientific. Okay? It can be observed, it can be quantified, it can be verified, and so on and so forth. And the main proponent of this would be Auguste Comte. Okay? Now, some philosophers take this positivistic attitude and apply that to language. And of course, one of the basic forms of language would be the proposition. But the proposition is composed of more basic elements like terms or words. So for them, only statements or propositions that can be reduced to simple statement of facts, they have real and intelligible sense, or they have real value at all. So when you talk of, for example, life after death, it does not have any positive value at all, because you cannot reduce that to a statement of fact. A fact for the positivist is a state of affairs. It is what is the case. Okay? So it does not have any real or intelligible sense, because you cannot do experiments or scientific investigations about them. We don't have scientific investigation, for example, of the soul or of the spirit or of the angels. So for the positivists, they don't have any positive value at all. It's not that they don't exist, but if ever they exist, we cannot verify them. So they might as well set them aside. Now, logical positivism, which we are going to discuss later on, is actually an application of this positivistic philosophy. But they applied positivism to language, okay, to propositions, to statements. And we're going to discuss that later on. Okay. Now, the next philosophy that emerged during the contemporary period is naturalism. And of course, we know that the main representative of naturalism is Charles Darwin. Okay. So, naturalism is also related to positivism and materialism because, again, this is an attitude in the sciences, okay, that we can only study what is found in nature, okay, what is concrete, what is physical, what is natural, or we can say what is biological. But the focus of naturalism is not really about nature only, but how species or organisms in nature operate, or how they exist, or how they adapt to their natural environment. Okay? So one of the basic premises of naturalism is that species, they have to constantly adapt to their natural environment. Species who can adapt, who can adjust to their natural environment, they will survive. Those that cannot, they will perish. So this theory or this philosophy advances the idea of the idea of what we call the natural selection theory. Okay? That there is a natural process in nature of selecting species that will survive. Those species that are fit, they will survive. So it's the survival of the fittest. And the fittest for them is not always the strongest. I mean, if you're going to compare an elephant and an ant, the elephant is stronger than an ant. But if you're going to look at the proportion of their weight as to the load that they can carry, an elephant may not be able to carry a load that doubles its weight, while an ant can. Okay, the elephant will have to move large area in order to get food. So they get food from the ground and then in the trees. What about the ants? Well, the ants can get food under the ground, in the ground, up in the tree. So the ants has a better chance of survival than the elephant. Now, this idea of naturalism about survival of the fittest was applied by some thinkers to society. If in nature there is survival of the fittest, because there's always a competition for the food, natural resources may be scarce, or if it's not scarce, it's difficult to get them. In society, it's the same. It's competition, it's rivalry, and it will always be the survival of the fittest. You call this social Darwinism. They apply the idea of Darwin. Originally, Darwin applied this idea to nature, to the species, survival of the species. But there are thinkers who apply this idea of Darwin to society. So this society is also a competition. It's also a survival of the fittest. The next philosophy here is utilitarianism, which is pretty much more of an ethical philosophy, because Bentham and Stuart Mill used utilitarianism or express utilitarianism in the ethical domain. So it's a kind of ethics based on the utility principle. Bentham is an associate or a colleague of the father of John Stuart Mill, James Mill. But it was actually John Stuart Mill, the younger Mill, who developed a kind of altruistic utilitarianism. Okay. So they propose this kind of utility principle, saying that the action must be guided by the amount of happiness that a particular action can produce to the greatest number of people. So it's an ethical theory as to how we can judge particular action, whether right or wrong. The good action is an action that will promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. So utility is happiness in terms of producing the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Okay. Now, let's go to the next here, nihilism. Well, nihilism is often associated with Arthur Schopenhauer and Friedrich Nietzsche. First, Schopenhauer expressed a rather negative view of reality and human existence. And he said that the will is a fundamental. Okay? The will is fundamental, and the individual will is only one universal will. So there's always the will to survive, the will to develop one's potential. But he characterized the will as something that is blind, that is irrational, to some extent evil, and therefore the source of all the suffering. And he associates this will to suffering because of the will for continued existence. And he arrived at the idea that we have to deny this will. Now, Nietzsche one day entered a bookstore, and he happened to encounter the will, the world as will and representation, this book by Schopenhauer, and he was amazed by the idea of the will of Schopenhauer. This passion, no, this irrational. For some people, being irrational is bad, but when you look at the when you look at the drang, or when you look at the urge as a will, is actually what drives man to do something. Irrational because it is different from reason. Reason makes gives direction, but without the will, reason will not move. So the will is the driving force of man. Okay, what 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 reason does is to guide, to give some directions, to restrain the will. But for Nietzsche, we should not restrain the will, because the will is actually the source of energy, and this is what uh, influenced a lot this idea of the will of Schopenhauer that influenced Nietzsche. Now, why nihilism? Nihilism in the sense that, first of all, Nietzsche is opposed to the idea that there should be a universal, universal morality or universal religion. Because this universal morality or universal religion, to some extent, curtails, deprives our will of its fundamental expression. So, and then metaphysics, and then this morality is based on a kind of metaphysics, a kind of system. And for Nietzsche, we should develop that will to power in us. So the nihilism there is that it's not something that we have to remove everything and then, no. The nihilism there is that we should not allow ourselves to be trapped into a kind of system where the system puts us down, then we can no longer express our individual will. Okay? So for him, Christianity is the morality of paltry people, because for Nietzsche, the Christians, they just follow the teachings without, without analyzing, without uh, examining the doctrines. Okay, so for example, in the Sermon on the Mount, when you say, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for they shall," etc., etc. But of course, it's a different story if the Christians are actually like that, because that's how Nietzsche saw the Christians. But it's a different question if Christians are really like that. Okay, if Christianity is, is really just the morality or of paltry people. Okay, so he opposed this kind of herd morality or herd mentality and advanced the idea of the Ubermensch, the man who desires through his will to power, and this will to power is the will to live in a higher, more powerful state of being. And Nietzsche does not see that in Christianity. But of course, you also have to ask the Christians if they do not desire a higher and more powerful state of being. So I would say that's the take of Nietzsche about Christianity. So let's just leave it at that. Okay. Now, the next is phenomenology. Well, we're going to discuss phenomenology in this course. So I will just mention some of the representatives here. Husserl, Scheller, Ricoeur, Carl Rogers in psychology. And then the existentialist thinkers, we have Kierkegaard, John Henry Newman. Some people don't recognize John Henry Newman to be an existentialist because he's not in the mainstream or the main, group of uh, French or German philosophers. And then Jean-Paul Sartre, Martin Heidegger, Charles Jaspers, um, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Gabriel Marcel, Albert Camus, Martin Buber, Paul Tillich, and many others. So that's the majority of philosophers that we are going to discuss. So I will not, I will just leave it at that, mention the names, and then we'll discuss them in our course. And then let's go to analytic philosophy or logical positivism. So this actually originated in the Vienna Circle. Okay, many of these philosophers are logicians. Okay, logicians and mathematicians, and they were actually, well, they were influenced, of course, by the logic of Aristotle, and then by the logic of by the what do you call this? By the inductive logic of or inductive philosophy of Bacon, Francis Bacon, and they were also influenced uh, by Leibniz when Leibniz developed this universal language. But for them, following Leibniz, there are two kinds of languages: the natural language in the universal language, which could be considered to be artificial language. But when you talk of natural language, I'm speaking in English, we're speaking in Tagalog, some people speak in Spanish, German, French, Russian, etc. These are natural languages. But if you don't understand French or German or English, then you will not understand those French or German speaking people. But if you develop a kind of artificial language, okay, kind of artificial language that would talk about facts, express our thoughts in terms of symbols, then the Germans and the French and the Americans and even Filipinos will understand one another. This is an artificial universal language. But when you talk of artificial language, there should be, this language should be talking about facts. Okay, facts. State of affairs. That's the term that I use, state of affairs. What really is the case? So like, for example, let's say the sun is shining. So it's the case because we can verify that, go out, you can see the sun is shining. The apple is red. You look at the apple is red. But suppose I say, I talk to, or my guardian angel is protecting me. Can we trace that statement to a fact, to a state of affair? My guardian angel is protecting me. Even if you look up, look around, you will never see angels hovering above you and protecting you. The first statement is a factual statement. Second statement is a metaphysical, spiritual statement. Okay? So it's not a positive statement. The second is not a positive statement. The first one is a positive statement. Now, the logical positivists, although they focus on this kind of reality, on facts, but they focus more on the language. They analyze the language. They analyze propositions. So proposition should be a proposition, should be a statement about affairs, facts. Okay? Wittgenstein, one of the proponents of logical positivism, in the last, number 7, last section of the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, wrote, those that we cannot speak about, we must pass over in silence. Those we cannot speak about. What does it mean? Those we cannot speak because we cannot trace it back to facts. Those are the things. So, for example, we cannot speak about God. because we cannot trace it back to facts. So you can see here the link between positivism and empiricism. Go back to empiricism, you would always say an idea is validated when we can trace it back to a fact. Talk about substance. In talk of substance, we cannot trace it back to a fact because we cannot see the substance. The substance is beyond our perception. Although, of course, Locke accepted that although we cannot speak of it because it's something beyond our sense perception, but it should be there behind the primary and secondary qualities. They begin altogether dismiss the substance. Now, the logical positivists, they don't want to talk about it. It's not that they're not siding, they're not saying that this, especially Wittgenstein, he's not saying that there are no metaphysical objects. Okay? It's only that we cannot talk about them because there's no way for us to trace them back to a fact. Okay? So Wittgenstein is he is a devout person. He believes in God. Only that from a philosophical, from a logical point of view perspective, we cannot talk about it. So let's just pass it over in silence. Okay? Out of respect to these metaphysical concepts or objects. Okay. And then, of course, the last here is pragmatism. This is actually a philosophy of the, in the American tradition. The main representatives here are William James. Before William James, there was actually Charles Sanders Peirce, and then James and John Dewey. Okay, so the pragmatists are actually talking. They wanted to stay on the middle ground between between the rationalist and the empiricist. But how do they settle that? They settle that through consequences, practical consequences. So how do you know if a particular idea is true? Well, if this idea will give us practical consequences, the consequences, for them, ideas makes a promise. So for example, I say, a stone is hard. My idea of a stone is hard. But how do I know the stone is hard? Well, it must generate some positive results, meaning some practical consequences. So, for example, a stone is hard, therefore the stone will not break, or you can use that to scratch another object or to break other objects. Now, if a stone can break objects, then it satisfies its promise that it is really hard. So the truth of an idea, of a proposition or anything, the truth of that is derived from its consequence, from its result. Okay, so that's well, of course, that's the basic idea of pragmatism. Then, of course, you have here some other philosophies, so I'll just mention them. Structuralism, evolutionism, and then psychoanalysis and neo-Thomism by these two French philosophers, Etienne Gilson and Jacques Maritain. Now, the whole point in discussing this is to give you an overview that contemporary philosophy is not just about existentialism or phenomenology or postmodernism. In fact, the postmodernism is way beyond the contemporary period, only that there is an overlapping between the contemporary into the postmodern, because some of the contemporary philosophers are already representative of postmodernism. So it's very difficult to draw the line between contemporary contemporary period and the postmodern period. Okay, because there's always an overlap between these periods.